There is no question, ladies and gentlemen, no reasonable doubt that Kirby Brown, Liz Newman, and James Shore all died of heat stroke or exposure to the intense heat that Mr. Ray created in that tent. All but one of the doctors who testified in this case agree on that point. 5 doctors testified in this case. 4 of the 5 say the victims died as a result of exposure to Mr. Ray's heat event, the sweat lodge, and the last doctor, Dr. Paul, the one hired by the defense, says he's not ruling out heat stroke and would agree it's heat stroke if he had the documented core temperature of 105. And then you have the 5th doctor, Dr. Paul, who has admitted that in the 10 to 12 autopsies that he has done where he diagnosed heat stroke, he never had a documented core temperature. That position is not supported, as you saw, by any of the literature produced by Dr. Paul for Ms. Doe and Mr. Hughes and produced here in court.
I'm going to object again, Your Honor. Misstates the testimony. All of the doctors said that dehydration was a component.
Ladies and gentlemen, again, what the attorneys say in argument, what the attorneys say is not evidence.
They all testified that their original conclusion that the patients died of heat stroke remains. You heard
Dr. Mosley did not testify to that. I'm very sorry. Dr. Mosley testified that he believed now that it was toxins. Objection. Misstates the testimony.
Your Honor, may I approach it?
Yes, you may. Yes, you may. Ladies and
The law makes no distinction between direct and circumstantial evidence. It is for you to determine the importance to be given the evidence, regardless of whether it is direct or circumstantial. In other words, from all the surrounding facts in this case, you can find by circumstantial evidence that the victims had that core temperature necessary for heat stroke. You heard Dr. Dixon testify that the idea of organophosphate poisoning is so far-fetched that he is not even willing to agree hypothetically that the victims died of organophosphate poisoning. Hypothetically, you're the only one with this conclusion that is different from Dr. Cutshall, Lyon, and Mosley. And you will recall the answer from Dr. Dixon when he said, hypothetically, pigs can fly, but I'm not going to concede that. Doubt based on speculation is not reasonable doubt. Doubt based on hypotheticals that assume facts that are not true is not reasonable doubt. Doubt based on a house of cards where every card is a joker is not reasonable doubt. The only doctor in this case who has treated live patients for organophosphate poisoning has rejected wholesale the notion that organophosphates caused the deaths of the 3 victims. Where it's written, secretions from every orifice may become copious and hinder resuscitation efforts. And ask you to think about all the evidence in this case, and did one single first responder, one single EMT, one single doctor ever talk about secretions from every orifice that were so copious that they hindered their resuscitation efforts? Dr. Paul has a wonderful resume. I'm not suggesting otherwise. But his opinion in this case has no credibility. A second issue about this question of testing for organophosphates is that there simply is no good test for organophosphates presence. But here's the simple facts. Over the next few days, no doctor ever tested for organophosphates because it was never indicated. This notion that the patients could have died from organophosphates poisoning is a complete red herring. And that large calendar that Mr. Lee had that he flipped through month after month, what was missing from that large calendar? What was missing were the hundreds of hours of interviews that Detective Diskin testified that he had done, all of which, as he testified, pointed him to not some mysterious toxin, but to the extreme nature of Mr. Ray's heat events as the focus of his investigation and the cause of death. The defense wants you to believe organophosphates cause the deaths and forget the following: that people get sick in that hot tent at Angel Valley only when it is Mr. Ray facilitating or conducting his sweat lodge ceremony. It doesn't matter if it's the same structure as it was in 2008 or a different structure as it was in 2007. It's the extreme nature of the defendant's ceremonies that causes people to get sick and that caused 3 people to die in 2009. When other people do it, no one gets sick. When Mr. Ray does it, people get sick. And you can consider that information in deciding whether it's some mysterious toxin or it's Mr. Ray's conduct, his extreme event that caused the victims to die. It is the ultimate heat challenge, this abomination of a sweat lodge ceremony, the extreme nature of Mr. Ray's conduct, the extreme heat and the extreme humidity that caused people to get sick, and finally caused the deaths of 3 people, and not some random patches of pesticides. On Thursday morning, about 3 hours before the participants entered that superheated tent, they were all told by Mr. Ray to write their obituaries. Dr. Bunn told you that she struggled all week over whether to shave her head and finally did so, 1 hour before that sweat lodge began. In her words, shaving her head was part of playing full on, and she did not want to be perceived as a person who was not participating. Dr. Bunn told you, having been told by Mr. Ray not to speak, how no one spoke in the first few rounds. And she described for you the heat, how she could feel the heat from the steam like it was fire, how it was too intense, too hot, and how she could not even sit up. And as she crawled toward the door to get out in the short time that that door was open, Mr. Ray said to her, "Beverly, especially you are stronger than this. You know you can do this. You can endure this." And you'll remember how Dr. Bunn testified, as several witnesses did, that she thought, well, obviously, Mr. Ray knows better than I do. He's done this before. You heard testimony from many witnesses, such as Brandy Rainey, about the growing chaos and distress outside the sweat lodge, about Lou and Dennis, both projectile vomiting, about Amy Grimes being brought out unconscious. But meanwhile, inside the sweat lodge, Dr. Bunn described for you how the conditions grew worse, how people deteriorated and collapsed. According to Dr. Bunn, not once, not ever, did Mr. Ray encourage anyone to leave who was not feeling well. To the contrary, and consistent with what he had told the participants prior to the event, it was an event to push through in order to have a breakthrough. That she saw Mr. Ray come out first when he finally ended his event, sweating and looking fine, and how he turned to his assistant Taylor Butler and asked, "What do you think about the sweat lodge?" And how Taylor answered, "Nobody does a sweat lodge like you, James." And then Brandy testified how Mr. Ray got hosed off, got some water, and sat in a chair in the shade, leaving the Dream Team members, the Mercers, and other participants to deal with the sick and the dying. Mr. Ray intentionally used heat to cause these extreme altered mental status changes in his participants. And that's why after the event, he comes out, he sits down in the chair. You heard how other witnesses reacted, and they're taking care of people, and Mr. Ray is just sitting there. That's because everything that happened was what he intended to happen, except for death. And Brandy Rainey, who came out after the 5th round, described for you how Tess Wong was brought out when it was over and was laying on the tarp making horrible sounds, having what looked like a seizure to Miss Rainey. Miss Rainey told you that the defendant, sitting less than 3 feet away, simply asked, "Who was making that noise?" You have learned through all the testimony that after the 5th round, Dennis moreover passed out. And when he awoke, he believed he was having a heart attack and screamed out, "I'm dying, I'm dying." And you learned that Mr. Ray did not take heed, but simply leaned out of the tent and yelled out, "Dennis, buddy, you're not going to die." Less than an hour later, 2 people were dead. Intentionally using heat to create an altered state and being reckless about the consequences is not an accident. Heat stroke or hypothermia is a horrific way to die. And what makes this case so unbearably sad is that it was entirely preventable. Death in that bogus sweat lodge was entirely preventable. Would 3 people have died if Mr. Ray had acted like a reasonable person in that situation? If Mr. Ray had done what a reasonable person would have done, we would not be here. If Mr. Ray had stopped his event when Amy Grimes passed out after the 4th round and was dragged out unconscious right past him, like a reasonable person would have done, would we be here? And what if Mr. Ray had stopped when Megan Fredrickson, his own employee who sat right beside him in the sweat lodge in the tent, had warned him, "James, these people are your responsibility"? What if Mr. Ray had stopped the event when Lou passed out and fell into the pit, as a reasonable person would have done? Would we be here? If Mr. Ray had stopped the event when Dennis crawled out, passed out, and came to screaming that he was dying, as a reasonable person would have done, would we be here? We don't quibble with the notion that Mr. Ray used death as a metaphor, but when you deliberately confuse a metaphor with reality, it is no longer a metaphor. Where is the metaphor in telling participants to push through the pain of your body collapsing from heat illness? And what if Mr. Ray had stopped his heat endurance challenge at the 6th round when James Shore dragged Sidney Spencer, lifeless, limp, and unconscious, right past Mr. Ray, out of the sweat lodge, and bumped his head on the frame as he went back in? What if Mr. Ray had stopped his ceremony, his heat endurance challenge then, when James Shore brought Sidney Spencer out? Would we be here? And if, when this horrific event, this horrific heat endurance challenge was finally over, would 3 people be dead if Mr. Ray had taken immediate action to save them? Mr. Ray had so many opportunities to change the course of his conduct, but he did not. And that is why we are here. But for Mr. Ray's conduct, the victims would not be dead. Mr. Lee said it was wrong for me to leave up photographs of these 3 victims when I did my first closing. What's wrong in this case is charging $10,000, telling participants you know what you're doing, telling participants to trust you and to set aside their own self-preservation instincts, and then recklessly, incredibly recklessly, holding this ultimate challenge, this heat event, and in spite of information that people are in distress, unconscious, not breathing, need to get out, continuing to act, continuing to create more of that searing heat and more of that searing steam. That's what's wrong with this case. Mr. Ray's conduct in continuing to introduce that lethal heat with 3 people down and in distress in his sweat lodge. We are here, ladies and gentlemen, because Mr. Ray, because of his conduct. We are here because Mr. Ray intentionally used heat to create this altered mental status and was criminally reckless about the consequences. That is what reckless manslaughter is about, and I ask you again to find the defendant, Mr. Ray, guilty of all 3 counts. Thank you.